chapter number 4. John chapter number 4. This is the real use for a tie. John chapter number 4. As you're finding John chapter number 4, you think about eagles. How well they see. Just a tremendous animal. You know, most birds of prey have absolutely tremendous sight. And you know, whether it's an eagle, a hawk, we have red-tailed hawks, especially here in New York, around Brooklyn, we have red-tailed hawk. Just a beautiful animal. And to watch them hunt rats and mice and even squirrels and pigeons sometimes, but especially the rats and mice. Where I work, there's lots of rats. In fact, where I work, rats make the news. But I have seen red-tailed hawks hunt them and catch them, and it's just a fantastic animal. You know, eagles are the same way. Various birds of prey, they have tremendous eyesight, and they can see from great distances. And not only can they see sharply at great distances, they can see in such a way that as they fly and as they dive, they continue to be able to see and hone in on their prey. They can see not just their motion, but they can see just so incredibly crystal clear. And scientists tell us it's because of something in their eye called a fovea. Now humans have this. We have one, and it is at the center of the retina, and it's a high density of cones that allow us to see at a certain distance, allow us to see sharply. The eagle pretty typically sees between 4 and 5, maybe even as much as 6 times as well as a human does. Now, what's interesting is these birds of prey, they have not one but the 2 of the fovea that gives them this crystal clear, sharp image, and they're able to see just so far away, great distances, very focused and sharp, which is what you need when you're doing these aerial acrobatics to hunt down a very fast-moving prey that is often quite tiny and moving through the ground. What's also interesting is dogs and cats, which have a far more superior sense of smell than humans do, they have none. Their eyesight is nowhere near as sharp, and of course they don't see in color, and there's a lot that they don't see. In fact, they see the world quite differently than humans do, which is a fascinating thing in and of itself, that these birds of prey are able to see. And what they do is they fly high in the sky, and they get a very big view of the land. They get a clear view of the land, and then when they find what they want, they are able to focus in. They are able to narrow in their sight and focus in what they want, and they're able to capture it. Well, in John chapter number 4, we're looking at a passage of Scripture that's fairly famous. And it is eclipsed, of course, by the passage that's before it in John chapter number 3, where Jesus said to a religious man, a very religious man, a member of the Pharisee sect, a highly educated, with a theological education, not just the secular education, an individual who understood the Scriptures, and Jesus says to him, "You must be born again." Not just you, but all of you that you're representing. The Pharisee sect that sent you, inquiring, "Nicodemus, ye must be born again. You all must be born again." And he says, "How is it that you don't understand these things? You're a master, a rabbi of Israel. Marvel not that I say unto ye, ye must be born again." And then it follows with the thought, if I be lifted up, I'll draw men to myself, in the sense that Jesus says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And then he says, the most famous verse in the Bible, "For God so loved the world, that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life." And it reveals to us this sense of life in Jesus. Well, chapter number 3 goes from the very religious individual who represents a community of religious-minded people who have depth and training, and explains to them that ye must be born again. And it immediately goes from John chapter number 3 where he says, if you have the Son, you have life. If you don't have the Son, you don't have life. The wrath of God is abiding on him. And he goes into John chapter number 4, where Jesus, on his travels, runs into a different type of individual, something that would classically be considered the opposite or a polar opposite in that community. Chapter number 4, verse number 1, when therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again into Galilee. And he must needs go through Samaria. So between the Sea of Galilee and those Decapolis, those 10 cities up that way, you had Samaria between Judah and Galilee. So he had to go through there. And as he's traveling up, he's traveling not too far away from the Jordan River, but a little farther out, a couple miles out from the Jordan River. And they're traveling, and the Bible says, then he cometh to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now, Jacob's well was there. Now, this is really the only real reference in the Bible to Jacob's well, although it was well known long before that. But this well existed outside of the city of Sychar, and itself is a landmark, even still today. It's a landmark. They have an Orthodox church, a Greek Orthodox church that's built over it. And it's probably the 5th or 6th church that has been built over it since about the 4th century. From about the 400s, there was a church there, and then it was destroyed, and then there was another one built. And then they destroyed it in the 500s, and another one was built at the end of the 500s, and then that lasted up to close to the Crusades, and it had fallen in disrepair. They came, they built another one. Then Suleiman, the Muslim conqueror, came in and destroyed that church. And then the Orthodox came in, the Greeks came in, built another one, and then there was nothing there from about the 1400s or so up to the 1800s. And they built another church on that. And those who had gone to explore this well found that today, of course, there is almost an altar on top of it. There is a hole there where you can get a bucket in, but you can get a man in. If he puts his arms over his head, he's going to get in, and it's about a 4-foot shaft that he's got to get through, which opens up into a 7.5-foot shaft. About a round shaft, 7.5 feet down. It had been bricked in, so to speak, with masonry, and then go deeper into brick. It's about 135 feet deep. So underneath this church, it's in the basement of the church, so to speak, with an altar there of sorts and lots of pictures and what have you. If you go through a small shaft, you open up into a large corridor down about 135 feet and explore from the late 1400s. It said when he measured the water at the bottom of the well, 135 feet down, was about 15 feet deep. Gives you an idea of what they're looking at. That well is about 4,000 years old now. It's got water down there on the very base or bedrock of mountain limestone. It's about 135 feet down. It was 7.5 feet wide, 135 feet down, and it's about 15 feet deep. Now, in Jesus' day, it's pretty clear that if you had to draw water from there, you probably needed to bring your own bucket. When you brought your own bucket, you may have needed to bring a rope. It's possible, though there's not evidence of it today, that perhaps they had a staircase going down like many of them did in that day, but there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of that today because the well has changed somewhat as people have needed it and used it. But now it's pretty much done with a bucket of rope, 135 feet of rope. And Jesus shows up there and he sees a woman. It says, verse 6, now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on a well, and it was about the 6th hour. The 6th hour means not 6 a.m., it's noon, it's 12 a.m. because this day starts at 6 a.m. John is using the Roman time. You've got 6 a.m. in the morning to 6 p.m. At the evening time, the day is over. Day starts at 6, ends at 6. Night starts at 6 p.m., goes to 6. There are 3 different times or measures of time used in the Bible. You just have to kind of know from gospel to gospel and epistle to epistle which is being used. There's Roman time, there's Hebrew time, and there's a quasi-Greek time. Kind of a Middle Eastern time. Generally speaking, Roman time is what we are familiar with and what we use today. But these are speaking on another time. This is 6th hour of the day. This is starting a day at 6 a.m. This is noon time. Measuring by a different time. So this is noon. So it's about high noon. And there cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. Now she is coming and she is alone, which is a highly unusual thing because most of the reputable women of the community come early in the morning before it gets too hot so that they can manage their day's responsibilities, manage their families, and draw water. These women would often come and they would draw buckets of water and they would carry them back to the house because there was no indoor plumbing. If you were going to drink water during the day or wash or do whatever your needs were done, they went and gathered water nearly daily. And the women seem to enjoy that. There's an interesting story about America and how we have our standards. And we talked about this place there in the Middle East over Afghanistan, close to the Pakistani border, where about 10 years ago or so, the Americans had come and they had put $1 million. Contractors coming in and running pipes and water because they were so third world that they still drew water from the well, and the women drew water from the well, and wouldn't it be wonderful? The Americans came in and spent all this money to dig a well and put pumps on it and make running water so that they would have running water in all the houses in this little village and just say, yes, America, and give them that spirit of, America's really a blessing. And I'm all for America, don't get me wrong. But it's an example of things that are a little bit out of touch because, they didn't seem to want that. Shortly after they had finished the project and there was running water in the houses of these women, they would no longer have to go down and draw from the well and carry all that water back like slaves to the house, right? The entire system was destroyed with hammers and rocks and beaten to death. Had busted open. End of the dream, and you say, well, what happened? Must have been those evil men who didn't want to have that and wanted to keep those women under oppression, right? Upon further investigation, they found out the local women of the village had come down and destroyed all those pipes. So what? Why would these women want to destroy these pipes that brought water into their house for the very first time? They didn't have to go down to the well. Well, because of the Muslim culture, they looked forward every day to going down to the well to talk to the other women because that would be the only time in their day they would ever see another woman they weren't related to in the house and have an opportunity to talk with somebody else. The women of the village destroyed it because it cut off all social communication. Now there was absolutely no reason for them to leave the house and see another soul. That was outside of their responsibility. A little spoken to cultural engagement. So the women had destroyed it so that they could continue their social club. They didn't mind the work, they didn't mind carrying the water. But what they did mind is being cut off from everybody else. Fascinating. Very much a part of their culture throughout the Middle East, and of course in this day women were no different. They went down and they got water together and were able to chat and socialize. This woman was down there in the middle of the day when it could be dangerous. What was she doing there at the well alone in the middle of the day? Isn't she worried about her reputation? Isn't she worried about being caught and raped or somehow otherwise abused and misused? And you'll find that she's not really afraid of that. In fact, she's pretty happy-go-lucky. She is a woman who actually rather personable. Doesn't seem to have a fear of men at all. What about that? It says, well, there cometh a woman out of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away into the city to buy meat. And there he was at the well by himself, and a woman there by himself. She naturally should have been afraid because there were no witnesses. And yet he starts a conversation and says, "Give me water to drink." And then saith the woman, verse number 9, of Samaria unto him, "How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans." Now, this is interesting in and of itself, because these people really have hard feelings. You say, how hard are the feelings? You know, we prayed on Thursday night for the Christians in Pakistan, and we prayed for the missionary group from Calvary Baptist Church there in the city who was in Pakistan when Asia Bibi, the Christian woman who was accused of blasphemy. She was accused of blasphemy, and the High Court overturned her conviction. They were going to execute her. She spent 8 years, a mother of 4, spent 8 years in solitary confinement because her Muslim neighbor accused her of blasphemy. And the blasphemy laws are pretty loose there in Pakistan, because you go to court and you're not allowed to repeat what the charge is. You can't say what it is that they said, because that would be committing double blasphemy. So they can say you said anything and charge you with blasphemy, and you can be convicted, because it's mostly a Muslim country with 15% of the country as Christians. So they got millions of Christians there. But it's a small population relative to the larger Muslim population. The Muslims abuse the Christians. They say she committed blasphemy, but they can't tell you what she said to be blasphemous. What did it all really boil down to? It really boils down to an argument that a Muslim woman was offended, her neighbor was offended, because she, a Christian, drank out of a glass cup, which the Muslim woman believed it should only be reserved for Muslims. Those dirty Christians shouldn't be drinking out of those cups. And she was offended that this Christian had drank out of a glass cup with her and her friends. And so she says and accuses her of blasphemy. The High Court, several politicians, everybody looked into it, and they knew it was a trumped-up charge, it was a lie. And some of these Pakistani Muslims have gone wild over there, creating riots and persecuting, abusing Christians. 2 of the politicians were executed who stood up for her because it was a trumped-up charge, it was a lie. These Muslims hate the Christians over there. They couldn't even drink out of the same cups. Not even the same cup, but the same cups that you, a Christian, would drink out of a glass cup like a Muslim. That's the blasphemy. And they were going to execute her. 8 years in prison, solitary confinement, kept away from her children and her husband. Well, thank God, international pressure, and our president that stepped in, and Jay Sekulow and Christian law also applied international pressure so that real justice can be done. And Pakistani's High Court overturned it, and now they're going crazy, and the Muslim group had stopped the Calvary Baptist Church, who was trying to get out of the country fast because it was getting nuts fast. Stopped them on the road to the airport, stopped their vehicle, and this Islamic group took them aside and won't let them out of the country. We'll pray for our Christian brethren, Calvary Baptist, here in the city. It gives you an idea how these people think, and this Samaritan woman. It says, how is it that you, a Jew, ask me for something to drink? You don't drink after us. I'm touching this pail. How do you know I haven't drinking out of this pail? I'm a dirty Samaritan. She's almost incredulous because she knows the contempt that Jews had for the Samaritans toward her. She had felt it and experienced her whole life. Samaria was very close to Israel, to Jerusalem and Judah, and Jews constantly passed through there. Her entire life she would have experienced this prejudice. And here this Jew, who is clearly a religious man, wearing the clothing of a Jew, asks her for water. She is incredulous, almost believing this must be a trap. Yet she's still not afraid. Verse 9, then said the woman of Samaria, how is it that thou being a Jew askest a drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Jesus answered and said unto her, if thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith unto thee, give me to drink, thou wouldest have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. It's a little bit cold, but she realizes this man's intentions are something other than her suspicions initially. And she was not afraid of him, and we'll find out why. You're talking about living water. This idea of living water is a play on words. You see, we understand it coming with hindsight 2020 as some kind of a spiritual thing, right? But living water is a common expression for running water. Water that is flowing. What happens to water when it sits in a well or sits in a pool or a pond? It gets all stagnant, nasty, and disgusting. Only these big old beasts of burden come by and drink out of it, and they alone can eat it. You and I get sick as dogs. If we had the immune system of an American alligator, we'd be fine, but we don't. Parasites and bacteria and stuff, we've become quite pampered. They say our ancestors just 1,000 years ago could handle quite a lot more than we handle today. Many of us would die if we drank just the water that our ancestors did 1,000 years ago. We've just been so spoiled by sanitary conditions. The water was only so good, you're always taking a risk. Even drinking from Jacob's well, but he said, I would have given you living water. Now, if you've seen the area where they're at, you know it's pretty savanna-like, and in the summer, it's downright desert-like. This is a well dug into the ground of what appears to be mostly sand with a little bit of grass here or there during certain seasons, keeping it together. Not a terribly fertile area. They went 135 feet down to find water. Water that was pushed up through hydrostatic pressure because, of course, these are mountainous-like areas. So they go down 135 feet to the hydrostatic pressure, about 15 feet of water at this stale pool, and they have to send down a bucket very, very deep to draw the water. That's a lot of work. I tell you, you got to have pretty good shoulders. I bet these women have pretty good shoulders. Carry a real load. And Jesus says, living waters? Well, living waters don't happen in a well. They happen on the surface. They're easy to get to. They flow, and living waters, or running water, tends to be cleaner. Safer to drink. Although today I recommend that you don't drink out of the river or the stream. You don't have any idea what's in there. Pesticides, pollutants, whatever. Get you one of those little survival packs and cleanse it. Don't take any chances of drinking water. Amen? Nobody wants to drink out of a gutter here for good reasons. None of us got the immune system of a pigeon. Jesus speaking about living waters. If you'd asked me, I'd have given you living waters. And she looked around and says, really? Where? We're a couple miles even from the Jordan River. Where are you going to give me flowing, living water that's not stale and disgusting? Well, the woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water, that flowing water? The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw. Where is the living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? This is interesting. Because she is identifying with Jacob. And the Jews identify with Jacob. She is showing a common human trait. Are you greater than our common ancestor? You Jews hate us and we hate you, but are you greater than our common ancestor? This is where the thing begins to get a little bit on the religious side. Now, why is this? Where is this Samaritan come from? What is this Samaria? If you go back into the Old Testament, 2 Kings chapter 17, you realize that Samaria is really the lands that had been a part of Israel, the 10 tribes in the north. 2 tribes in the south, Benjamin and Judah, were separated after King Solomon's sons had basically lost the kingdom and had divided it, and there was all all kinds of political and cultural infightings. And you had Saul trying to bring the 12 tribes together. You have David who brought the 12 tribes together. You have Solomon, the compromiser. He was wise, but he was almost a fool sometimes. The wise compromiser, who kept those tribes together, created an economic force, but he had allowed so much religious toleration. There was a lot of religious toleration. And he had married so many wives, and his heart was drawn away from God by those wives, and his desire to compromise. To compromise, they created a society that peaked, economically had peaked, under King Solomon. And then his heirs, those who would inherit, they could not keep it together. Mostly because they didn't have a foundation where they were truly sold out to God. See, Solomon had a foundation where he knew God was God, and what he did was he started from a position of strength and he moved to a position of compromise. But he had the foundation of the strength that God is God and there is no other God. But through compromise and trying to get along and go along to keep people together and bring the country together and keep economics roaring for the sake of peace, he said, let's keep the nation first. And we know God's important, but he compromised with all the other nations to keep peace and economic prosperity. And it went on for a while. You can do that for a while. You can have a multicultural society where there's multiple religions, and as long as everybody's making money, you can get that to stay going for a while. But then, when it all caught up with those who would come after him, who did not have the talent or the personality or the ability, and quite frankly, his children were raised in households where they had a divided loyalty between the gods. See, the God of the Bible is a spiritual God. The gods of this world, they're fleshly gods. The God of the Bible, the God the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he is a holy God. So much so that the Canaanites and the Egyptians referred to the God of the Jews or the Hebrews. They called them the holy gods. In their mind, they used the plural, recognizing that there was something distinct and different, that they were holy and separate. And they required a standard of living which was uncommon. It required a standard of living that required abstinence from certain behaviors that were codified in the religions of the other ones. The other religions of the other gods, their purpose was to seek prosperity and pleasure. The gods of the Canaanites, the gods of the Philistines, the gods of the Chaldeans, the gods of the Egyptians, the gods of the Hittites, the gods of Europe, they were all gods that glorified the flesh. They promised pleasure and prosperity. Pleasure and prosperity. Solomon enjoyed pleasure and prosperity, and yet he had a foundation from his father and his upbringing of this holy God. And there was prosperity in his day. But his children and his children's children did not have a deep sense of the holiness of God. There were preachers who kept preaching even in the midst of a world that was becoming increasingly corrupt through their multicultural religious experience. But what had appeared to be a strength and a unity eventually turned into a fractious environment. Because of the disunity in the religions, what would end up happening is there was not that unity, and so when things began to go wrong, what did people do? The cracks began to fall along the lines of their loyalties. People who are addicted to drugs, they usually start out fairly prosperous, and then you watch their life descend to the place where they are stealing and lying and cheating and selling their bodies and doing whatever is necessary to get enough money. They don't even see how far that they have fallen. They are willing to do anything to keep that pleasure. To keep that pleasure rolling in. they often do not see how far they have fallen until they have that awakening moment. People who are addicted to pleasure want to maintain the status quo. Everybody wants to maintain their standard of living, don't you? But too many people aren't able to roll with it. They're not able to cut back. They're not able to do without anymore because they become so used to having the standard that they've accustomed to. And when they can't get it, what do people get? They get mad. They get angry. They get furious. They don't just take it on the chin and say, well, we're just going to have a good attitude and start over again. What do they do? They riot. They complain. Well, the people of Israel, 10 tribes of Israel, Judah, they like that pleasure and prosperity. They get addicted to it. They got their own ideas, and of course, over time, it began to fracture. See, 2 Kings chapter number 17 tells us how the influence of these foreign religions had changed them. It had absolutely changed them. The Bible says the children of Israel in verse number 9, God had gotten upset at them and was going to cast them out. Verse number 8, verse number 9, and the children of Israel did secretly those things which were not right against the Lord, their God, and they built them. It describes to them what was not right. They built to them high places in all their cities, from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city. The high places are references to how the pagans worship. They try to get as close to heaven. You get that Rocky Mountain high. You get up there. You get as high as you can up on a mountain. Oh, you get that experience, right? You just kind of feel the wonder and the power of nature. Worship up on the high mountains. After all, Elijah did battle where? On top of Mount Carmel, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. What a tremendous view they had. Tremendous, beautiful view on the highest part of the mountain. They built an altar. It says, whichever God answers by fire. Elijah defeated the prophets of Baal on their own turf. Called down fire from heaven to consume the altar and everything. Because they like to worship up there, and they planted trees on the highest place. Because they like to worship the spirits in the trees, and they put them in a certain arrangement, usually in circles, in groves and in circles, and they worshipped a certain way. They had an affinity for nature. They were environmentalists on some level, worshiping nature. They like to worship Gaia, the god of the earth. Gaia is a Greek word for earth. Not unlike they are today, not unlike what the Celts did, not unlike what the Indus Valley did, and many of the pagans and the shamans, they worship nature, and they worship the gods of nature. They saw a spirit in all of nature. Survey Today says of the New Age ideas, some 60+% of all Christians hold the New Age ideas, anti-biblical New Age ideas. People who call themselves Christians. Catholics will hold up to 70%, but evangelicals, Protestants, almost 60%, and evangelicals, most evangelicals, it says, 40-something% will hold at least one New Age idea. And evangelicals are supposed to be the biblicists. We're supposed to center our life around what we find in the Bible. We have 40+% of people who identify in surveys as evangelicals. Not just Protestants, but evangelical, the more serious kind of Christian. Hold at least one New Age idea. No wonder there's a resurgence of these New Age ideas, the popularity of witchcraft on TV and around the city. People want some kind of power, spiritual power and connection without repenting and dealing directly with the God of the universe. They want a God they can identify with, not a God who chose to identify with them through Jesus Christ. In fact, many of them are anything but Jesus kind of people. Jesus was a good man. He was a spiritual guy. They'll give him that. They'll say, sure, he was somebody who was in touch with it, but I can get in touch with my spiritual power and the God inside of me too. That's how they think. And they'll set Jesus aside. At best, they'll set him aside as someone who was in touch with his own spiritual power. And they say, well, I want to encourage myself to be that way too. They blended the religions of the world with Christianity and the religion of their culture. And we, just like Samaria, are headed down the same road. You see, and they set them up images, verse 10, and groves in every hill and under every green tree. And there they burnt incense in all the high places, as did the heathen whom the Lord carried away before them, and wrought wicked things to provoke the Lord to anger. For they served idols, whereof the Lord had said unto them, Ye shall not do this thing. Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all the prophets and by all the seers, saying, Turn ye from your evil ways, and keep my commandments and my statutes, according to all that the law which I commanded your fathers, which I set before you in my prophets, and my servants the prophets. Notwithstanding, they would not hear, but hardened their neck, like the neck of their fathers, that did not believe in the Lord their God. And they rejected His statutes and His covenant. They rejected His laws, His rules, His standards. They rejected His covenant. And He made with their fathers, and His testimonies, which He testified against them. And they followed vanity. They followed emptiness. They followed pleasures. They followed the world and became vain. They started from a position of strength and they moved to a position of weakness. And went after the heathen. Not only that, but they chased after the heathen's religion. They went and purposely tried to live like the rest of the world lives. And they went after the heathen that were round about them, concerning whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do like them. And they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made them molten images, even to calves, and made a grove, and worshipped all the hosts, or all the armies, or the little deities of heaven, and they served the Baal. Baal means lords. Sometimes the God is used, they use the word Baal and Adonai, but it just means lords. When they say the Baal, they're talking about the false god. These Baals, what they would do, they had images of strength, like a bull would be a strength. And these were very large bulls, 1.5, 2 times the size of a modern bull. An animal's strength and wildness and virility. And they worshiped that because that's what they wanted to be like. These were their heroes. These gods were their heroes of strength and virility and pleasure. And they did what they want. They acted wild. They partied. That's how they were. This is what they were worshiping. This is the way they wanted to be. They would hope that these gods would bring prosperity and pleasure to their lives. They would keep the good times rolling. They keep the money rolling in, the physical substances rolling in. God says, all these nations around you, I told you, don't live like them. And what are you doing? You're living just like them. And they caused their sons here. They had completely adopted abortion. And they caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire, and used divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do evil things. When they passed through a fire, they had a statue of the God of prosperity. And he was hollow, his big brass statue, and his arms were held out like this to receive offerings. And they lit a fire underneath him, and the fire would go up underneath him into the cavity of his skirt and through. And he would get so hot that as a brass statue, he would glow. He would glow from the heat. So it looked like he was alive or real. And there in the fire underneath him, and he was glowing, and his arms were out like this. Prosperity. People would put their children, they would abort their children. They would give them their babies and pass them through the fire. It was ancient Planned Parenthood in that day. Because, you went in prosperity. If you're out sleeping around with everybody, you're going to have babies. But you don't want a baby. You want prosperity. You don't want to be held back. You want to keep partying. You want to have a career. You want to do what you want to do. You don't want children holding you down. Well, you can get a twofer. You can get rid of the child, and you can please the God of prosperity and say, "Oh, God of prosperity, bring me more pleasure, more prosperity in my life. I don't want to be held down like children." And so they would offer their children in the fire. They put them in the arms as an offering, so that those gods would bring water to the land. That they would see your sincerity and dedication to them, and they would bring prosperity into your country. So now you don't have to feed another mouth, but you got extra money in your pocket. That was the idea. And of course, if you understand that idea, when you read the prophets later on, you understand how God is saying, "I'm the God of prosperity," and I challenge them. When Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal, they would cut themselves, they would cry out, they partied, they had the drum music, and and they dance around, and they pour themselves out, and they use drugs, and they pour themselves out before their gods to try and get in touch with their spiritual power and collectively bring their spiritual power to bear. And they were trying to bring their gods to awakeness, to bring down fire from heaven. These are the same prophets who kindled the fires that received those babies on the brazen statues that would glow with fire. They received those offerings. They didn't want to keep the good times from stopping. They got rich to maintain power over the people. They practiced all kinds of immorality. There was no standard. Everything was acceptable. It was an anything-goes society on so many levels. And they were at the top of the heap. They were the Hollywood of their day. And they were in control. And so they used this culture that they had created of pleasure and prosperity to attract people, because everybody likes to be comfortable and they like pleasure. They like prosperity. Who doesn't like pleasure? Who doesn't like pleasure and money? Who doesn't like being able to get whatever you want whenever you want? That's why people play the lottery. That's how it got to be $1.5 trillion in the midst of one of the best economic boons the country has seen in a long time. Low unemployment. And yet people are still trying to play the lottery, because when you win $1.5 trillion, what does that say? It means there is no limit to the pleasure and prosperity that your imagination can get from it, is it? Sure it is. That's why people do it. They want to be in control. They want pleasure. They want prosperity. They want to be comfortable. So what did they do? They left all the commandments and they served Baal. Caused their children to pass through the fire. In verse number 18, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only. But Judah kept not the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the statutes of Israel, which they made. And the Lord rejected all the seed of Israel and afflicted them and delivered them into the hand of spoilers until he cast them out of his sight. For he rent Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and Jeroboam drave Israel from following the Lord and made them sin, a great sin. Poor leadership. And the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam which he did, and they departed not from them, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said unto his servants the prophets. So Israel carried away out. So he goes on, right? The king of Assyria, who came in and took the Israelites away, brought in men from Babylon. He brought in people from other countries on purpose with different gods and different religions. And he settles the land that way to divide and conquer. He does it to cause the land to submit so they cannot unify again, and they won't be able to fight against him from a biblical point of view. So they bring in from Kuath and from Ammon and Hamath and from Seraphim, and they placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. They possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. These were men, and they took the women that lived there, and that's what happened is they became the new fathers. These people from other countries with other religions became the new fathers with the women that had left, because they took the men there and they took them off to Assyria, and they left the women and they brought these men in, and those men married those women and brought a blending of the two religions in the family. And it was at the beginning of the dwelling, and they feared not the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them and slew some of them. Wherefore they spake to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations which thou hast removed in cities, and where it goes is they brought in all these gods. Read on down to verse 30, 31. They brought these gods, and they blended the religion. So there was a fear by verse number 32. So they feared the Lord and made unto themselves of the lowest of them the priests for the high places, and sacrificed for them in the houses of the high place. They tried doing both religions at the same time. They tried to say, the religion of the Bible and the religions of the world are just the same and they're just as good. In fact, we should just blend them together so we can have peace. So we can just get along. Well, they feared the Lord, verse 33, and served their own gods after the manner of the nations whom they carried away from thence. Unto this day they do after the former manners. So where it is going there in this whole chapter is basically summed up in that. The Samaritans, which at this point will be some 700 years later, are the descendants of these people with the blended religion. That is why the Jews hated them. The Jews hated them because the Jews were trying to be very sincere, especially there in Judah and around Jerusalem. They were being very sincere and they were trying to keep themselves from being polluted. And the Samaritans were a polluted people with a polluted religion and a polluted culture. They had both Yahwehism and paganism blended together, and they created their own religion out of that. They never prospered. The Romans didn't seem to have a problem with them because they never prospered. The Jews, however, when we're in John chapter number 4, had no dealings with them. Lest they should be influenced by one another in a negative way. And Jesus says, no. You guys are worshiping up on a mountain because it's a blended, polluted religion. Look at our passage in John chapter number 4. This woman begins to realize, and we're almost done, that Jesus is speaking to her about something spiritual. Art thou greater than our father Jacob, verse number 12, which gave us the well and his children and his cattle? Jesus says unto her, verse 13, whosoever drinketh this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up unto everlasting life. The woman saith unto him, Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. There's almost a mocking tone in her voice. Remember, she's suspicious of Jews because Jews are suspicious of them. And this guy is talking all coded like. And she's really not being sincere. She's mocking him. Then the woman said unto him, Sir, give me this water that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. Mocking him, Jesus said, let me take a different tack. Verse 16, Jesus said unto her, Go call thy husband and come back. Come hither, right? The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said unto her, Thou hast well said, I have no husband. For thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband. And that thou said truly. Saidest thou truly. Jesus recognizing all kinds of things we're not going to talk about, but he's recognizing the difference between living with somebody in sin and actually being married. Just living with someone in sin doesn't make you married. Jesus says, you have somebody now, he's not your husband, but 5 other men that you have were your husbands. And he's recognizing that divorce and remarriage, that each one of the marriages afterward were a genuine marriage, but Jesus says we shouldn't live that way. And then this woman had been married 5 times. Wasn't very old, she married 5 times and she was now living with a man. One of the reasons she probably wasn't intimidated by him being a man at the well, she'd already been with a lot of men. She had a bad reputation to begin with. Who knows? She might have been abused as a child and couldn't stay stable. She certainly had a quick tongue and she wasn't afraid to talk back. And this man she was getting smart with could have beat her. And who would have said anything? She'd probably been used to that already as well. She wasn't afraid of that. There's no indications he was some kind of kung fu master. She had probably been raped many times in her life. She knew many different men. She was a woman who was a survivor. She was a woman who knew how to get along. She was a woman who knew how to get what she wanted. And yet Jesus shows that he knows her. And by indicating this, because of course she's here in the middle of the day, meaning the other women didn't want to be seen with her because probably of her reputation. All the men already knew her of reputation. And yet Jesus was not afraid to talk to her. Not afraid to engage her. Not afraid to show her who she was. And he says, you know what? You're a soul. You're a soul that God loves. You're a soul that can be forgiven. John chapter number 3. You had the religious men who worked very hard at being strict in their lives and seeking to try to win salvation through their own human efforts. Here was a woman who clearly had given up on salvation for herself. But she grew up in a culture where things were told, things were spoken, rumors were made. She realizes this man who she'd never met knew a whole bunch about her. And so verse number 19, she says, the woman saith unto her, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. You're talking to spiritual stuff. Sorry, I mocked you, but it's clear that you know some things. There's something about you. I perceive that you are a prophet. She says, okay, so you're a Jewish prophet. Now she's going to talk religion. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and ye say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. Notice he uses the word ye again. Ye is the plural of you in olden days. Today we just use you and you. The Scottish people still use ye. In Scotland, it is still part of the common language to use ye. But ye is the plural of you until it fell out of use. John chapter number 3, Jesus tells one representative of the Pharisees, he says, ye must be born again. You all must be born again. Not just you, but you and everybody you represent must be born again. Hyper-religious, and here he is talking to a Samaritan woman who has a perverted religion and is outside of the faith, and he is talking to her alone, and he says, ye, all of you, you and who all you represent of the Samaritans, ye must be born again. He says, and when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father, ye worship ye know not what. You don't even know what you're worshiping. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews, but the hour cometh, that means the hour is in the process of coming, and now it's arrived, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh, is looking for, such to worship Him. These are the kind of people God is looking for, those that worship Him in spirit and in truth. He is clearly changing the direction of worship, that worship is not tied to a place. There is no Christian pilgrimages, if your Christianity is right. It might all be wonderful to visit the Holy Land. I hope to do it one day. I hope to see Jacob's Well one day. But it will not make me more or less spiritual. You can live your entire life and never see one holy relic, one ancient church, not one place in Israel, and you can die living a wonderful Christian life pleasing unto God, because spirituality happens right here. The holy place is in the human heart. It is not tied to physical things, but Jesus is making it clear the Spirit is what matters. God is a Spirit, and they that worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such. This is the kind of person God's looking for. He is changing the nature of religion altogether. It is not tied to what your eyes can see, but what the eyes of the human heart can see. Jesus says, do you have eyes to see and ears to hear? You see, many people are living as these Samaritans. Now this woman, she does get saved. She has an epiphany. Unfortunately, it is because she has so messed up her life, what this man is offering is pretty good. So whether you're religious or completely debauched, Jesus wants to bring us to the same place. He says, other sheep I've had this fold, and they might come together. He's trying to bring people together to one place, a place where spirituality comes from the heart. He's speaking of a spiritual Jerusalem, a new Jerusalem. The old Jerusalem is destroyed. He said, the hour is coming when neither in Jerusalem, because shortly after his resurrection, so 4 decades after his resurrection, Israel would more or less cease to exist. There would be lingerings, but the temple would be destroyed, the city would be sacked. There would be no more temple sacrifices or worship. Samaria would be sacked. No more should they worship up on the mountains, but we should worship God in spirit and truth no matter where we get scattered in the world. You can take Jesus with you because the world belongs to Jesus. And it matters just where you bow your heart to pray. That is where God is. It was so nice to have Brother Heckert here the other day, standing outside of the Carnival, standing as a family, two families, right there on Bath Avenue, praying. In spirit and in truth. That's what God is looking for. Verse 24, God is a spirit, they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. The woman saith unto him, I know that Messiah cometh, which is called Christ, and when He is come, He will tell us all things. And Jesus saith unto her, I that speak unto thee am. She goes and tells everybody. You know, one of the first people He tells that He's Messiah is a Samaritan. The next person he lays out that he's actually the Messiah is another one who is outside of the Jewish religion. And finally, in John chapter 9, He lets this guy who was born blind know that he is Messiah. He just tells them plainly. Everybody else He keeps guessing. But those that He has compassion on, that He trusts with, He told them directly. He gave her heart assurance that He is the Messiah. She says, I know when Messiah comes, He'll tell us all things. He says, I am the Messiah. He didn't tell the Jews that. He didn't tell Nicodemus that. He said, Nick, you have a book. You judge for yourself. But to this woman who had 5 husbands and was currently living in sin with a man, who wasn't married to him, He changed her life and introduced Himself as the Messiah. Changed her life. She went back and told everybody. You got to come see this guy. He told me everything. He knows everything. This is surely Messiah. She became one of the great evangelists of the day. Loving God and learning to worship in spirit and in truth. Learning to separate herself from a culture of pleasure, seeking pleasure and prosperity. They traded that in to serve God. Let's all bow our heads, close our eyes, and no one looking around as our time is up.